The next recession in Europe will not come as a result of a blunder by a US bank or a result of a blunder by the Fed or President Trump. No. The next recession in Europe will come as a result of a German problem. The bill for Germany's irresponsibility will be due very soon, and the rest of Europe will pay for the majority of it. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so since I owe you a lot of footage from Germany, I might as well put a lot of it in a video, about Germany. Especially given that one of the arguments in support of the thesis that the next recession will be bred in Germany is related to the way the country feels when you're on the ground, so the footage may help drive the point home easier. Now, I have routinely half-joked in the past that Europe suffers from a German problem, but when it comes to the economic near future of Europe, it may not be a joke after all. Sure, it may not be entirely visible as of right now, but then again, many of the predictions made here on Freedom Alternative almost 5 years ago were not exactly visible and ended up happening. Once again, I do hope I'm wrong about this in the sense that the worst excesses of what's about to come will not materialize and that this will just be another economic slump like many others in the recent past and not so recent past. So, with that being said, let's dive in. So there are 6 reasons for which I believe the next set of socio-economic troubles in Europe will have their source in Germany. Number 1, Deutsche Bank. 2. The German industry. 3. The German-led Eurozone. 4. The increasingly extremist political class. 5. The unacknowledged political corruption. And 6. The shockingly apathetic populace. So we'll go through each of these, show you the facts, leave some more reading material in the description for those who want to know more, and then, based on those facts, we'll make the argument and then offer some ways for individuals to take shelter. So with that said, let us begin with number 1, Deutsche Bank. Now, this ought not to be confused with the Deutsche Bundesbank, which is Germany's central bank. Deutsche Bank is an investment bank of the caliber of Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, or Credit Suisse. Deutsche Bank is reportedly the 17th largest bank in the world by total assets and by far Germany's largest banking institution. And Deutsche Bank is in trouble, and it is in trouble in ways it hasn't been in decades. You see, at this level, litigation is the absolute norm. Any investment bank of this caliber has a dedicated line in their budget for paying off lawsuits. So it should thus be no surprise when I tell you that Deutsche Bank paid roughly $100 billion in the last decade just to settle lawsuits alone, many of them with serious allegations of corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, industrial espionage, and so on and so forth. That in itself is not evidence of trouble, not at this level. However, unlike other big investment banks, Deutsche Bank has been running at a net loss for years now. While during the 2008-2009 crisis, the bank ran a loss for a year, it quickly recovered. But this time, it doesn't seem to, and it is unlikely to. While in 2009, the announcement that Deutsche Bank ran a loss in 2008 was a bit surprising because the bank had not recorded a loss in 5 decades, In the current year, the announcement that Deutsche Bank ran a loss goes almost unnoticed, even for those interested in financial news. And that's because Deutsche Bank losing money is not really news anymore. Since the last quarter of 2013 and until 2015, Deutsche Bank has been losing money consistently at a rate of at least $1 billion per quarter. Then it got worse. In 2015 alone, the bank totaled a net loss of more than $7 billion. That's when the bank started inviting even more trouble, and the Chinese conglomerate HNA became the largest owner of shares. Even with the Chinese money, the hemorrhage did not stop. In fact, things got worse, and in 2018, the offices of the bank were raided by the police in connection with a large case of money laundering. You see, while Deutsche Bank and the German government kept on complaining about organized crime in Eastern Europe, Deutsche Bank was laundering more money in a month than the organized crime in all of Europe in a whole year. Everyone from Iran to North Korea or the Russian mafia had a stake in the giant money laundering operation ran through the Deutsche Bank. By mid-2019, the bank had reached to a point when it announced the firing of 1/5 of its employees in a bid to stop the consistent hemorrhage of money. At the moment of this recording, reports for 2019 are still not available, but given the numbers available on the stock market, let's just say that nobody appears to believe this is anywhere near enough to fix the problem. And the problem is Deutsche Bank itself. Its organizational culture is terrible. Its investment decisions have been consistently terrible for almost 8 years now. And while the American division appears to be passing the stress test, most of the rest of its divisions, including the German one, most definitely do not. Then there are the reputation issues. Almost every big corruption scandal in Europe in the last few years has had some Deutsche Bank corruption. One of those that made headlines was last summer when Deutsche Bank paid almost $200 million to settle a lawsuit involving Deutsche Bank officials giving out bribes to officials in the Netherlands to get building contracts approved without really following the Dutch law. And this wasn't a one-off or a situation of a rogue employee trying to advance faster. No. This was an operation like many others of which the top officials were entirely aware of. All of this led to the situation of the clients withdrawing up to $1 billion per day. All of these facts are available for you to investigate in the description box. So, considering all of this, the existence of Deutsche Bank going into the 2020s is, at the very least, debatable. The 2008 crisis started with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, a firm smaller than Deutsche Bank today with fewer entanglements and with an overall situation nowhere near as bad as Deutsche Bank. So unless some miracle happens, the fall of Deutsche Bank in Germany will make the fall of Lehman Brothers look like a walk in the park by comparison. And given Deutsche Bank's entanglements all over Europe, in addition to regular people in Germany, when this baby collapses, a recession may be the least of our worries. Number 2. The German industry. The German industry is the heart of the German economy, and has been since forever really, and given that most of Europe is in the Eurozone, which de facto means hundreds of millions of people forced to use the Deutschmark, the German industry is where everyone is setting their economic clocks from in terms of how things are going. And they're not going well. Last month, the German industry hit the biggest downturn since 2009, and there is absolutely no sign that any of this will get better anytime soon. In fact, the German industry has been declining for 2 years in a row, as the graph you're looking at shows, and such a consistent period of decline hasn't happened in decades. More likely than not, a new record will be set either this year or in 2021. The European Central Bank, which the Germans treated as a German domestic institution, and I can't blame them since most of Europe has been intentionally stripped of its economic independence in the name of sucking up to Germany and claiming that's somehow a good thing. Anyway, the European Central Bank just announced yet another round of quantitative easing, which is a nice way of saying money printing. Inflation and a suboptimal value of the currency does indeed help the exporters. Now, of course, the ECB will not outright say in public that this is to help the German industry at the expense of literally everyone else non-German, but the coincidence is very difficult to ignore, quite frankly. The chattering class is blaming all of this on the trade war between the US and China, even though the German industry has been in trouble long before any step had been made into the direction of a trade war. Not to mention that many of the problems felt by German workers today are at least in part the result of the so-called Hartz Plan back in 2003, implemented by Gerhard Schröder, one of the most corrupt politicians in Europe in the 21st century so far. Mr. Schröder now serves as the chairman of the board of Nord Stream AG and is basically paid by Vladimir Putin to do the bidding for Russia's geopolitical agenda in Europe. As I always say, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And blaming the current situation on President Trump or on the trade war is the kind of simplistic nonsense pushed by NPCs for whom anything beyond Orange Man bad is just too complicated to grasp. Speaking of Russia and Nord Stream, the highly controversial project has just been subjected to US sanctions as a result of the lobby from the Intermarium. This is very good news for most of Europe, but the industrial sector in Germany will not be happy given that it has been forcibly dragged into all of this based on Merkel's overconfidence. Merkel will pay by being dragged out of office, a bit fallen out of grace, but nobody will compensate the German worker for the losses incurred as a result of treasonous political decision-making overseen by both Merkel and Schröder. On top of all of these, add the almost inevitable problems that will emerge in the industry as a result of political decisions, which I'll analyze in Chapter 4. Once one looks at the totality of these issues, it really does sound like wishful thinking to imagine that the German industry will incur anything but more downturn throughout 2020. Of course, if you say this in public, the chattering classes will tell you that you're wrong because for more than a decade they, the chattering class, convinced themselves that Germany cannot fail and that nothing can go wrong. Such a belief has reached religious levels in some circles, but economics simply doesn't work that way. Number 3. The German-led Eurozone. The euro currency is, for all intents and purposes, the Deutschmark by another name. And it only works for as long as the political classes, the banking classes, and the population trusts the whole thing. The problem is that increasingly the last two categories, the banking classes and the population, are becoming increasingly skeptical of this. And for good reasons. The banking classes are worried that the euro currency just simply does not seem to function like any other normal fiat currency, and the population is asking whether the net loss that all of them suffered as a result of switching to euro was indeed worth it, given that whenever their own nations are in trouble, they simply can't pass whatever measures they may deem fit for their economy. And they're both correct. Raiffeisenbank, an Austrian banking conglomerate, has quietly been dropping the euro currency from wherever it could. Even though Austria is in the euro currency, its flagship private bank is taking advantage of its position in the intermarium to discourage savings in euro and encourage saving in US dollars and national currencies instead. There are other smaller banks who do this too, and many investment banks are more or less openly discouraging their clients from using the euro currency if they don't have to. Meanwhile, the general public everywhere except Germany is starting to realize that their countries suffered a net loss in standard of living solely because of the switch to the euro. The most extreme example is Slovakia, a country in which regular people lost roughly 40% of their standard of living and never recovered since switching to the euro. Most recently, the German Center for Economic Policy in Freiburg concluded that only Germany and the Netherlands gained anything from switching to euro, while everyone else incurred a net loss between 1999 and 2017. The biggest loser, according to them, Italy. Your average Italian lost almost 74,000 euros between 1999 and 2017, exclusively because his country dumped the Italian lira and joined the German-led Eurozone. A quick visit to houseofitaly.com shows us that one can buy pretty decent homes for that price in Italy. So every Italian lost at least an apartment because his or her country decided to be part of the German-led Eurozone. And the populace is increasingly aware of that as more people start to remember that with a monthly wage of 800,000 Italian liras, a family of four could live pretty well, while with the equivalent 800 euros a month right now, not even one individual can make ends meet. Throughout the 2020s, more people will realize that and will start questioning the very existence of the euro in much harsher terms than so far. And once that happens, the troubles will start. And Germany will necessarily suffer first, just like Germany necessarily benefited first and the most as a result of the introduction of the euro. The only ones still not questioning the Eurozones are the political classes and their useful idiots. For a while, that will be enough to keep the machinery going, but for how long? How long will the insistence that nothing's wrong with the current model be swallowed up by the electorate? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that in economics, justice is always rendered in the end, even if it can take decades. After all, it took almost 25 years until everyone figured out Greece, but it still happened. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank is still trying, 20 years since the creation of the euro, to convince people to use euro as a currency more than a speculative asset. And it is failing, even if it has had the political backing for it and forced hundreds of millions of people to adopt it as a currency. Even with all of that, the project is still not working. Interest rates on the euro are negative and inflation is stagnant. Now, that in itself wouldn't be a problem, but the ECB wants really badly to increase inflation in the eurozone, and no matter how much it tries, inflation refuses to go up, which suggests that not enough people are buying into the narrative. Again, I could be wrong, but ever since 2005, when I started keeping tabs on this, I was never wrong when it came to predicting consumer reaction. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a dude on a couch with footage from German trains. Number 4. The increasingly extremist political class. While the mainstream chattering class in Germany keeps on telling you about the dangers of the so-called far-right parties and ideologies, the reality is that the only extremist problem that Germany has is an increasingly far-left political class. 2 months from now, in Berlin, a new law will come into force which will cap rents, allegedly a measure aimed at easing the housing crisis in the capital city. In reality, a measure introduced to please the increasingly extremist far-left sector that wants nothing more and nothing less than Soviet-style nationalization of private homes. The measure is not yet into force, and the few optimists left still do hope the measure will be overturned at the country's constitutional court, but the effects of it are already here. The Financial Times noted in January 2020, quote, "Confidence in the legal system has been shaken, and when that trust is destroyed, it takes a long time to rebuild it," says Mania Schreiner, managing director of the Berlin-Brandenburg Builders Trade Association. She said the consequences were already being felt. Landlords have stopped all major building work, plunging tradesmen such as bricklayers, plumbers, and electricians into crisis. They've basically stopped doing everything but emergency repairs, she said. You're seeing the first cancellations, with investments originally planned for this year declining dramatically and order backlogs shrinking fast. The warnings of a slowdown have been rife, both from the private and the public sector. The BBU, a trade association that groups private and state-owned developers in Berlin and Brandenburg, says its members expect to lose 1.1 billion euros in revenue over the next 5 years, invest 5.5 billion euros less than planned, and reduce construction by at least a quarter as a consequence of the rent freeze, unquote. Many regular people and pension funds have also bought apartments in Berlin as part of the pension plan, so this is already having a negative ripple effect all over Germany. And if the measure comes into force, things will necessarily get worse, and the effects will not be limited to Berlin, as the construction sector is reliant on labor force from all over the country and even outside of Germany itself, particularly the Intermarium area. And then there is the issue of increasingly radical environmentalism that crept into more and more local administrations. The measures that outright ban diesel cars in many cities, for instance, will also have a net negative effect on the German industry and ultimately on the German economy itself. Add on top to that the issue of mass immigration, which is in itself a drain on the German economy, while the maximal state keeps on churning out press releases that claim the integration of so-called refugees into the labor market is going really well and, quote, better than expected, unquote. Any person that has been to Germany knows this is simply not true. Even judging by the official numbers, less than a third found a job in the last 5 years, and most of them on temporary contracts. Additionally, most of them, including those technically employed, still live in subsidized housing, so realistically speaking, almost all of the new influx are a net drain on the German economy. Sure, the German economy in 2015 or even 2018 looked like it was healthy enough to take that hit and absorb those costs without much fuss. But now, as things are moving, it does not exactly look like that anymore, and it's not going to get better. Back in 15, I made a video asking whether we're heading towards a Franco-German collapse. Almost everything I said then has now happened, and unlike 2015, the economics look a lot worse. In 2015, I was assuming that the economy will stay pretty decent at least until 2022. Well, I might be proven right on that too, as the economic troubles in Germany may be successfully swept under the rug for as much as 2 years from now. But still, the left-wing extremism of the political classes is an issue that will necessarily reflect negatively on the economy of Germany for the next several years. Now, some will say that this is not something new, and in a way, that is correct. It's not like there has been a time in Germany's history when the political class was not extremist, but in the past, the checks and balances kept the extremists away during times of economic troubles, at least after World War II. This does not seem to be the case today. Number 5. The unacknowledged political corruption. One cannot talk about German corruption without talking about Gerhard Schröder, whose notorious relationship with Vladimir Putin has in itself given rise to a new word about corruption: Schröderization, or Schröderisierung in German. The word is in fact quite common in political analysis in Russian, spelled as Schröderizatia, meaning the corruption of a political elite in another country. Now, some will say that bringing up Schröder in 2020 is old news, but it isn't. In 2018, Merkel's administration was the biggest advocate for Schröder in order to avoid putting the former chancellor on the sanctions list, even though the list was supposed to be precisely for those who promote Putin's projects abroad, with Schröder being quite literally Putin's paid lobbyist. But the corruption goes a lot further than that. The Bundestag itself is comparable in corruption with Belarus, but you will never hear that in the German media or in the German-aligned media. The Groups of States Against Corruption, GRECO, is an institution belonging to the Council of Europe, and it lists 13 countries in Europe as being heavily non-compliant and with a very poor track record when it comes to combating corruption in their ranks. These countries are as follows: Belarus, Hungary, Luxembourg, Ireland, Turkey, Romania, Portugal, the Czech Republic, Denmark, France, North Macedonia, Germany, and Austria. Yet you'll never hear about this in the German media. You will never hear in the German-friendly media that in the Bundestag the influence of foreign lobbyists is a lot higher than in the United States. Yet the European press will never shut up about the dangers of lobbyists in the United States while conveniently ignore the significantly higher corruption problems in the German parliament. In Germany, legislators aren't even asked about any potential conflict of interests between their own private interests and the interests of the legislature. Yet the same legislators have no qualms in lecturing Eastern Europe about corruption as if it's at the very least comparable, if not worse. The exact opposite is the truth. And again, it's not me saying that. It's the Council of Europe following years of analysis by legal experts from all over the continent. Besides the GRECO report, there is also the completely unacknowledged corruption in the German media. In fact, if you dare to mention it too much, you'll find yourself labeled as a conspiracist at best or a far-right figure of hate in a regular day. You see, the fact that the German media conglomerates, including the state-owned ones, have legal bribing mechanisms in order to avoid having foreign media diverting too much from the Berlin-approved narrative is something that you're not supposed to notice. The EU allegedly runs a program made to ensure that media pluralism is observed in its member states. Yet for some reason, that program only seems to apply to Eastern Europe, Italy, and the United Kingdom, but basically never to Germany, France, Denmark, or Sweden, because, you see, the state dictating media agenda is absolutely halal, especially if Germany does it. Just like multi-institutional collusion to intentionally hide the truth for days on end, like it happened with the New Year's Eve incidents in Köln a few years back, that's also okay. That's not enough to warrant at least an investigation. But say something bad about a certain religion of peace, that's a breach of media pluralism, you see. And on like that it goes. Almost every institution, both local and federal, in Germany has unimaginable levels of corruption, but almost none of it is even acknowledged, let alone tackled in any meaningful way. And again, that wouldn't be such a big issue if not for the German officials lecturing other countries about corruption and transparency, or for the fact that Germany is about to severely damage the economies of most of the rest of Europe. Also, the level of corruption also makes it difficult to assess the economic problems to begin with. Officially, Germany is not in a recession yet. That's what the state says. But it's quite difficult to believe them given the independent data available. In the real economy, already very few people believe that, and the assumption for 2020 is that Germany is already in a recession. Nevertheless, the corruption in the German institutions is making the whole situation worse and will, in itself, be an additional factor when the crisis will finally hit. And finally, the sixth reason, the shockingly apathetic populace. I said at the beginning that there are 6 reasons for which I believe there will be a serious economic crisis quite soon, and it will be led by Germany and German irresponsibility. The first 5 are institutional reasons and quite abstract, albeit well documented. But the 6th is the German people themselves. Sure, there are quite a few Germans who understand all of this and are likely to watch this video and agree and maybe even share it around to others. But, by and large, the German population quite simply does not care. It's not that they're necessarily radical, they just don't give a toss. In Yuri Bezmenov terms, significant chunks of the German populace is essentially demoralized. They will not acknowledge the facts, let alone their own culpability in the issue, no matter how much one tries. On top of that, you have the sizable minority that has been successfully subverted. I have personally met people who vote for the Green Party because that's what good people do, and they want to be good people. When asked whether they believe or agree with certain key Green Party policies listed, they said no. But they also had no idea that those were in fact the policies of the Green Party. They just want to be good people. I mean, how do you work with that? That chunk of the populace is, for all intents and purposes, a giant NPC blob. One can see it in their eyes. They would accept almost any dictatorial policy as long as it can be presented as that's just what good people do. And some of that is present at the institutional level too. Older subscribers might remember, and the newer ones are advised to consult the description box, of the video I made back in 2016 with a German father whose daughter was murdered by cultural diversity while he was a top official advocating for that diversity. Even such a personal hit did not make the father at least question the whole narrative. And that, my friends, is scary. And it's one of the reasons I can't be optimistic. A significant chunk of the German population will, for sure, sleepwalk into both economical and social abyss without much regard even for the consequences to themselves, let alone the consequences to everyone else outside of Germany. And based on these 6 reasons, I believe it is reasonable to expect a German-led recession that will affect almost all of Europe. Now, sure, in the abstract, some could say that this may not be such a bad thing because it would also expose the irresponsibility of other governments, and in a way, that's true. I mean, I fully do expect that the Hungarian government will get quite a harsh punch in the throat as a result of such a recession, given that the economy of Hungary is doing quite far from well. But at the same time, it also means that millions of innocent people will suffer more than they would have suffered otherwise, solely because Germans keep on voting for more of the same. More economic irresponsibility, more radicalism, more corruption, and quite frankly, more disdain for everyone else's well-being. It is not exactly a secret among researchers that, by and large, as long as the economy goes somewhat well, the Germans will tolerate almost anything without batting an eyelid. So of course no one cares about the corruption or the huge losses incurred by other peoples of Europe as a result of the German-led Eurozone. However, once the economy starts going wrong, Germans usually vote for the savior that shouts the loudest. And that's the problem now, because the savior that shouts the loudest is the Green Party. The former pedophile party, today a far-left organization that makes the DDR look moderate in comparison. Sure, some of this may change in the light of the debut of the crisis. There's still plenty of time till the next federal election. After all, exactly 1 year ago, the CDU appeared to be impossible to beat, as this graph shows, and yet a lot has changed since then. But given the apathetic populace and given that so much of this information is being intentionally obfuscated in the German media, there is very little room for optimism from where I'm standing. Also, given how hard the German political class has fought to stop Brexit by any means necessary, it will not be surprising at all when they will try to blame things going wrong in Germany on Brexit. And there will be millions of NPCs in Germany that will believe it too, and tens of millions in Europe overall. The question will be whether less insane and less apathetic forces will be able to mount enough support to counteract this. And I have to admit, I'm not optimistic on that front either. Having attended the meeting of the free media in the Bundestag back in May 2019, I will say that what I saw there did not increase my level of optimism by much. Most of the peeps involved in the non-aligned media are stuck into discussing points and arguments that simply do not matter to most people. I'm sure they will rush in to say that I'm wrong, but if I'm so wrong, why do the politicians supported by them rarely get at least the votes the non-left should be able to rely on, and even more rarely they get elected? Sure, there are exceptions. I won't name names here because this is outside the purpose of this video, but the trouble is that the parallel infrastructure doesn't work. It's not that it doesn't work well, it doesn't work, period. Almost none of their narratives are successful, and part of the reason is because their narratives are not interesting. They're poorly constructed and focused on topics almost nobody cares about. And that shouldn't be a huge surprise. After all, the non-leftist media is itself a reflection of the public, so apathy is to be expected. So is ignorance of relevant topics. If that starts to change, then there will be reasons for optimism, at least at a political level. Another barrier is in the widely believed narrative that if a politician is discredited, then that politician has been punished thoroughly and just goes away. As the cases of both Schröder and Merkel show, that's just simply not true. Both Schröder and Merkel could not care less that they've been quote-unquote discredited as they cash in their enormous benefits from Russia or from other institutions while serving 0 days in jail and while they don't even have to account for their corruption to anybody. This is a lesson non-leftist politicians will have to learn too, as they're so afraid to even utter the truth in fear of being quote-unquote discredited, as if that means anything in reality. Well, it doesn't. Not in Germany anyway. I know many of you wish it would, but it just simply doesn't. Alright, so at the end of the day, what can the regular person do? Well, for starters, don't hold any assets in euros. Anything you have in euros is essentially a bet in favor of the German economy, and that is not a sound bet, especially with your pension or other long-term assets. If you can't avoid the euro, at the very least make sure the assets are in Germany and not other Eurozone country. Why? Because if the euro is to collapse, the first thing that happens is fractionalism, namely that the Italian euro, the French euro, the Estonian euro, or the Slovak euro will have a different value than the German euro. I'll let you guess which way the difference will go. It will still be terrible, but less terrible if fractionalization catches you holding German euros. Again, this is in the case you can't avoid the euro entirely. Secondly, if you hold sensitive assets in Germany, try to sell, preferably this year. If you hold an apartment in Berlin, you should have sold already. Close this video and start looking to sell right now. That's an asset that is going down in worth as we speak. You don't want to hold real estate in a place where nationalization is a popular opinion. Thirdly, if you're poor or working class, see if your source of income is directly related to the German economy or the euro currency. Chances are that it may indeed be the case if you live in Europe. If that's the case, start working on having an emergency fund and cash in US dollars. Every normal person in Europe should be holding at least $2,000 in cash in their house. You never know when you'll need it, and if I'm right, you'll need it pretty soon. If I'm entirely wrong, it's still a very sound financial decision to hold a few US dollars. With all of its problems, the US dollar is still significantly safer than any currency in Europe, with the possible more recent exception of the Swiss franc, which, by the way, may indeed be a good option for the Germans living physically close to Switzerland itself. Fourthly, if you're financially solvent, look up for shorter-term loans in euro. You might be able to take advantage of the negative interest rates. Some would also advise on the longer-term loans too, given that a full-fledged crisis on the euro currency will lead to terrible exchange rates that are to the advantage of the client. I'm just not happy with advising anyone to contract long-term loans for anything, really. So there's that. And finally, don't buy German right now if you don't have to. I'm referring here to capital goods, such as new cars, equipment, and so on and so forth. Just wait for 6 to 8 months from now. It is very likely that they will be cheaper. Also, when the crisis finally hits, there will be some very nice opportunities for those who held on cash, but I won't get into that. That's for private consultation. I will say this, though. The old adage that one man's crisis is another man's opportunity will hold true for the German-led recession too. Just think of how many people, both rich and poor, will try really hard to dump as many previously inflated assets as possible. So, yeah, that's really all I had to say on this topic. A recession is coming, that's for sure. How serious it will be is still up for debate, and I won't venture into making predictions. But not preparing for it is, in my opinion, bad financial decision-making, a process that should be left to the Bundestag and the Ministry of Economic Affairs, while regular people should strive to be smarter than that. Who knows, maybe a miracle happens and the decision-making process suddenly improves. But the sound approach is to avoid betting on miracles. I'm just saying. Also, keep in mind that all of this applies to you if you live anywhere in Europe or Russia for that matter. Stop concerning that much about what President Trump is doing. President Trump is unlikely to affect your checkbook. But Chancellor Merkel and the Bundestag very likely will, and not in a positive manner. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website, freedomalternative.com. Subscribe to our social media. Many thanks to Shice Squad for the music and for the help with the tour in Germany. Don't forget to send me to the Gulag, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.